This story today is called My Naughty Little Sister and the Ring. So I've got a special ring to show you. This is a ring that my granny gave me. It's a lovely blue colour and it's very sparkly. You see it? See if the light will catch it. It sparkles and sparkles. And my naughty little sister really liked sparkly things. She liked holding sparkly things, sparkly jewellery. There was something else that she liked to do that babies like to do as well, and I hope you don't do it. A long time ago, when I was a little girl and my sister was a very, very little girl, she was always putting things into her mouth to see what they tasted like. Even things that weren't meant to be tasted. And even though our mother had told her over and over again that this was a naughty thing to do, she kept doing it. Our mother would say, "Look at that child, she's got something in her mouth again." She would pick my sister up and say, Now, baby, give it to mother." And my naughty little sister would take it out of her mouth and put it into mother's hand. My sister tasted all sorts of silly things. Pennies, pencils, nails, pebbles, things like that. Our mother said, "One day you will swallow something like this and you will have a tummy ache." But do you know, even though my sister didn't want to have a tummy ache, she still put things into her mouth. Our mother said it's still a very bad habit. Well now, one day a lady called Mrs. Clark came to have tea with us. Mrs. Clark was very fond of children. And when she saw my little sister all neat and tidied up for the visit, she said, "What a dear little girl." Now, my little sister was quite a shy child. And sometimes when people came to our house, she would hide behind my mother's skirt. But when Mrs. Clark said she was a dear little girl, and when she saw what a nice lady Mrs. Clark was, she smiled at her at once and went and sat in her lap. Mrs. Clark played ride-a-cock horse with my little sister. She took my sister's fat little hand and played round and round the garden. Then she told my sister a funny little poem and made her laugh. My little sister did like Mrs. Clark. She liked her so much that when Mrs. Clark and our mother started talking to each other, she stayed on Mrs. Clark's lap and was as good as gold. First, my sister looked up at Mrs. Clark's nice powdery face. Then she twisted round and looked at the pretty flowers on Mrs. Clark's dress. There were some sparkly buttons on Mrs. Clark's dress too. My sister touched all those sparkly buttons to see if they were hard or soft. And she turned again and looked at Mrs. Clark's hands. When Mrs. Clark talked, she waved and waved her hands. And my little sister saw that there was something very sparkly indeed on one of Mrs. Clark's fingers. My sister said, "Button, pretty button," and she tried to get hold of it. Our mother said, "Oh, why, she thinks it's one of your buttons." Mrs. Clark said, "It's a ring, dear. It's my diamond ring. Would you like to see it?" And she took the ring off her finger so that my little sister could hold it. The ring was very sparkly indeed. My little sister turned it, and lots of shiny lights came out in all directions. Sometimes the lights were white, and sometimes they had colours in them. My sister couldn't stop looking at it. Mrs. Clark said that my sister could mind her ring for a while, and then she and my mother started talking again. Presently, my little sister began wondering if the ring would taste as sparkly as it looked. So she put the ring in her mouth. And of course, it didn't taste like fizzy lemonade like she thought it might. After that, my sister listened to Mother and Mrs. Clark talking. Mrs. Clark was a funny lady, and she said things that made our mother laugh. And although my sister didn't know what she was laughing about, my sister began to laugh too, and Mrs. Clark hugged her and said she was a funny little duck. It was very nice until Mrs. Clark said, "Well, I think I must be going home soon." Because then she said, "I'll have to have my ring back now, lovey." But the ring wasn't there. It wasn't in my sister's hands. It wasn't on the table or on the floor, and it wasn't in my sister's mouth either. Our mother said, "Did you put it in your mouth?" And she looked at my sister very hard. And my sister said in a tiny, tiny voice, "Yes." Then our mother said, "She must have swallowed it." Mother looked so worried when she said this that my sister got very, very frightened and began to scream. She remembered what Mother had said about swallowing things that weren't meant to be eaten, and she said, Oh, tummy ache, tummy ache." But Mrs. Clark said, "It wouldn't be in your tummy yet, you know." The sensible lady said, "We'll take you along to the doctor." But my sister went on crying and shouting, "Swallowed it, swallowed it." No one could stop her. Then Father came home. When he heard the noise, he was quite astonished. He shouted, "Quiet, quiet," to my sister in such a bellowy voice that she stopped at once. Then Father said, "What's all the fuss about?" And our mother told him. Father looked at my little sister, and then he looked at Mrs. Clark. He stared very hard at Mrs. Clark, and then he laughed and laughed. "Look," he said, look at Mrs. Clark's button." Mrs. Clark looked. Mother looked. Even my frightened little sister looked, and there was the ring hanging on one of Mrs. Clark's shiny buttons. My little sister had taken it out of her mouth and hung it onto one of Mrs. Clark's dress buttons to see which was the most glittery, and then she'd forgotten all about it. When our mother had said she must have swallowed it, my sister really thought she had. She even thought that she'd had a tummy ache, and she'd screamed and made a fuss. What a silly child. Mother and Father and Mrs. Clark laughed and laughed. They were so glad that my naughty little sister hadn't swallowed the ring after all. My sister didn't laugh though. She hid her face in Mother's lap and wouldn't come out again until Mrs. Clark had gone home. But she never put anything in her mouth again except the right things, of course, like food, sweets, and toothbrushes. So I know sometimes babies and little children like to put things in their mouth to find out what they're like, but make sure you don't ever put anything in your mouth that shouldn't be there in case you swallow it. It would be very, very dangerous. I'll see you next time. Bye bye.